Welcome. Welcome to the primer series on information and communication technologies for the youth. The primer series is intended to help our young people, our students in universities and also their faculty, to understand the different linkages between information and communication technologies and development, particularly as they are used and practiced in the Asia Pacific region. This, what I am introducing you to, is the first issue in the series of ICTD for youth, and that is issue 1, an introduction to ICT for development. This series is designed so that it can be done in parts or all together, and this first issue of the series, which is an introduction really, covers a broad range of topics which will actually be dealt with in more detail in more issues which are soon to come. The idea today is actually to take you through the basic concepts and to take you through the basic ideas and to take you through examples of where today's information and communication technologies have been used to successfully address the problems of poverty, the problems of food, the problems of equality, the problems of education, the problems of environment, and also to show you how different countries have tried to use these technologies. This particular primer issue, series 1, has 3 sections and 12 chapters. Each section has a learning objective and outcomes. Each chapter has a practical exercise and a small test that we will be asking you to do. There are also case descriptions given in each chapter for you to study on. You can use these cases to understand how things are working, or you can work with your fellow students and with your faculty to develop new cases for use in your own country settings. At the end of the course, you may want to use the template that is provided in the text version of this primer in order to create cases. If you are going to create cases, please remember that this is only a suggested template. You may want to add more or you may want to add less information, but this is the basic information that is required if one is to understand how technologies are used. Therefore, in order to provide some logic and some sequence that will help us proceed through actually what is a large amount of content, and that will be useful for all students in all disciplines, whether they come from communication, whether they come from IT, whether they come from humanities, whether they come from English, or whether they come from some other field. The primer has been designed as basic reading, and we estimate that it would take a 3-credit 1 semester course, which is a foundation and which is to be seen only as an introduction. You are welcome as faculty and students to use this primer as you see fit, as essential reading, as supplementary reading, all together as a logical whole, or bits and pieces, parts that you find useful for exploration. You can move forward, you can move backward, you can move to small chunks of knowledge, and you can use them as you see appropriate. By no way are we trying to say that this is either a definitive or an exhaustive test. It doesn't stand alone. It is to be used in tandem with other materials in the field. I would also recommend that when you watch this program and when you also read the text, that you read them alongside each other, because alone you may not get the maximum value out of the content provided. For instance, if you are using only the PowerPoint slides, you will lose the richness of the text. If you are using only the text, you will lose the richness of the audio or the video. So my recommendation to you is to go through the text alongside the PowerPoint slides and alongside the explanations that will be given to you here, and then also to do the practical exercises that are provided and to do the multiple choice test, so that you can understand whether you have learnt the material or not. There are no right and wrong answers. You can go forward, you can go backward, you can go whichever way you want. The idea is that either standalone or individually, this primer issue 1 should be of use to you. So, how have we structured this issue 1? Essentially, as I authored it, I put it into 3 sections. The first section, which is essentially dealing with concepts, basic concepts that all of us have to understand before we can proceed to look at ICTs. We will be taking you in this first section on concepts through 2 major themes: understanding human development and ICTs for development. Section 2 really looks at how different countries in the Asia Pacific region have tried to use ICTs to address their development goals. In this, we have, for purposes of understanding, divided this particular section into 4 major chapters. ICT, the applications in core sectors, is chapter 4. Chapter 5 looks at ICT applications in sustainable development. Chapter 6 looks at ICT applications in governance and peace, and Chapter 7 looks at ICT in culture and tourism. The third section of primer issue 1, which is a very important section, but to which we have to come after we have understood basic concepts and applications, is section 3. Here we look at all the issues that are necessary to manage ICT for development interventions. For example, we look at how we plan and manage projects in the section on issues in project management, chapter 7. Here we look at policy and governance, the project cycle, change management, and building partnerships. In chapter 8, we address an equally important topic, which is content management. What are content issues? What is content? And how is content developed? And how do we develop it today? Plus ethics, copyright, and intellectual property rights. Chapter 9 looks at the technology itself and managing it. Choices, access, and costs are dealt with in this chapter. Chapter 10 looks at ICTD, or Information and Communication Technology for Development. Henceforth, we will call it ICTD, Human Capacity Building. Who are the people who need their capacities to be built up to use ICTs for development, and how do we go about building capacity for the future? The last chapter is called ICTD Project Evaluation. Much of what we know today is because people have gone to the field and assessed whether projects work, don't work, when they fail, or whether they succeed partially. To do this, we have to understand what are the concepts in evaluation, what are the stages, what are approaches, methodologies, and tools, what are different ways of doing evaluation, and finally, what makes ICTD evaluation different. The last chapter, which is chapter 12, is a very brief conclusion. In the text, you will also find a glossary of terms, additional references, also information about leading international organizations that are working in the field of ICTD in the Asia Pacific region. You will also find case studies of where young people have used ICTs for social networks, for connecting, for applying these to real causes in the field. So, all in all, when you look at these PowerPoint presentations, when you look at what I am telling you today and you see it alongside the text, it is a very rich mosaic of learning materials. So, let us begin by enjoying ourselves, by enjoying the learning process, and hope that we learn something new in a field that is fast emerging as one of the key disciplines in today's era and in the 21st century. So, where do we begin? We begin at section 1, that is the section that deals essentially with concepts. Why do we need to know concepts? Because unless we are clear in our definitions of what it is we want to do, and unless we are clear in our approach to the idea of development, we cannot proceed to understand the linkage between technologies and development. So let us begin now with section 1, with chapter 1, which has as its theme understanding development. But even before we get to chapter 1, I have listed for you what are the learning objectives of this particular section. Section 1 really hopes that we can introduce you to the basic concepts of human development, to the link between communication and development, to the concept of the digital divide, which is a term frequently used the world over, to definitions of ICTs, and to introduce to you a taxonomy of ICTs and the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different communication media and information technologies available to us. After completing this section, we hope that you will have understood the key concepts and understood how communication has been used, have begun to think about ways of bridging the digital divide in your own settings. You would have looked at ICTs and their strengths and weaknesses, and you would have looked at how there are changing trends and what makes this change take place. So let us begin by trying to understand development. All of us, particularly those of us who live in the Asia Pacific, are familiar with a long history, not just of history of ancient cultures coexisting in harmony and peace, but also of centuries of what was known as the colonial era. In many of our countries, we were plagued by problems of poverty, disease, malnutrition, lack of education, especially when our countries became free and became independent sovereign nations. There are many ways of understanding development, and it is a concept that is very difficult to define and to understand, because each of us, when we think about the term development and when we ask people to define it, defines it in a different way. So therefore, development is a highly complex concept. It is contradictory, it is full of debates, and it is full of what we call discourses based to some extent upon political ideology, economic reality, the way we understand development and cultural harmony, based upon certain perspectives of ethnicity and religion, and therefore it means different things to different people based on economic, geographic, political, social, cultural, religious and ethnic contexts. So what religion influence in terms of development is how a person sees development. Political ideology of a country, whether it chooses to be run by a central government or it chooses to be a confederacy of many different states coming together for a common cause, also changes the way we understand development. But since the second half of the 20th century, that is roughly from after the time when World War II ended in 1945, and when the United Nations was set up and when other agreements were set up, the term development has been extensively studied from the perspective of many academic disciplines. Very often, economists looked at economic development as a key to social development. Sociologists looked at old societies and new societies. Psychologists looked at how the individual changed from being old, backward, to a modern materialistic society. In political science, people looked at whether people participated in the democratic process or they followed a more cultural, group-based, community-based approach to life. So it has been definitely and extensively and complexly studied, but most of the time the term development became synonymous with growth, modernization, change, democracy, and many similar Western values, and at the beginning was focused largely on economic development. Why did this happen? This happened because a large number of the scholars, researchers, thinkers were essentially at that time in the Western countries, whether in the USA or in Europe, and therefore naturally their perspectives would have given weight or would have had weight in terms of their own way of looking at development. It is but natural that the academic disciplines and the political, cultural, social backgrounds of these scholars would have influenced the way they thought. So when we look at the way in which development has been studied for the last 65 years or so, there have been three major political perspectives to the study of economic development. The first of these perspectives was the Western free market approach, and if you will look around you, you will be able to identify countries that have followed this path. Essentially, when we looked at economic development, we began to understand factors such as GNP or gross national product, gross national product per capita, or that means the GNP divided by the population size to try to understand how much each person was contributing, GDP or the gross domestic product, and the GDP per capita. The idea basically was that as GNP and GDP would grow and as per capita income increased, development would then gradually percolate from the industrial sectors of society, and it would move down to larger populations and to the poor. And many countries adopted this model, and the reforms that were proposed on the basis of this model by several international agencies such as the International Monetary Fund. And you may again look around and think about whether your country or your context setting has followed this particular model. If so, what are the characteristics? If so, what are the indices of development? But there was extensive criticism of this particular model because there were many changes taking place in the world, and ultimately in the economic crisis of 2008, when particularly the Western countries and Europe were largely affected, and in turn they impacted upon the lesser and the developing countries, the economic crisis essentially brought an end to an understanding that economic development alone would lead to a society's development. The second major stream was coming from what we call the erstwhile Soviet Union, and it was a planned economic approach which basically said that there would be extensive state involvement in planning and management of economic systems. Many countries in the Asia Pacific region also followed this planned approach to development. And in this planned approach, essentially it meant that the state, in order to provide development to its citizens, was a major player not just in the provision of services, but in manufacturing and also in trade and in public distribution systems and supply. The collapse of the former Soviet Union and many changes in economic policies in China effectively ended the era of planned economic approach. There were many countries that followed neither this nor that, neither the Western economic free market approach or the planned economic approach of the erstwhile Soviet Union. The mixed approach, which was also there among many countries, basically combined to some extent private sector growth alongside planned investment in the economic system. One good example of a country that followed a mixed approach is India, which followed it until the 1990s. Parallel to all this work in economic development was an understanding by teams of social scientists from different disciplines. We had people from agriculture, from rural sociology, from anthropology, from political science, from psychology, from humanities. And for all of these people and all of these academics began to try to understand the forces that would bring about change as development at the individual level and also at a larger societal level. Okay. Many of these scholars drew a difference or made a difference between what was called a traditional society and what was considered to be modern behavior, and looked at modernization in stages as a process. Essentially, we talked about the traditional societies, tribal societies with strong individual community leadership, as opposed to the individual modernizing as being some of the more traditional. And in the modern society, you had the individual choice, freedom of decision making, freedom of employment, the individual freedom being more important than the community goals at large. Modernization and development for these scholars very often meant that a change from or a move from the traditional community-based feudalistic society to ones that stressed innovativeness, education, political participation, access and exposure to information that changed people's way of thinking. So the difference between what was traditional societies and what was modern was essentially a change in people's way of thinking. But neither of these approaches, whether the economic or whether the social development approaches, neither of them are mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive. Among the things that was found throughout 45 years of economic development history is that very often in many countries, the statistics that were collected at the macro or national level did not really reflect ground reality. This meant that although you may have had very high growth rates, we also had a lot of poverty in the villages and in the communities. Economic growth did not necessarily lead to poverty reduction. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. High growth rates were visible alongside large poverty and deprivation in many societies. There were increasing inequalities, not just between the rich and the poor, but also between men and women, boys and girls. There was social disorder, there were riots, there were changes in the way that young people and even older began to express themselves, and there was a colossal environmental degradation. The environment was being destroyed as we tried to bring about economic development. Given all of this, it was around 1990 that a series of writings by two very eminent economists brought about a new paradigm in development. This particular paradigm looked at the process of development through a more people-centered and humane approach. The two economists who looked at this and who were the pioneers were the Pakistani economist Mehboob-ul-Haq, a very eminent economist who wrote extensively on what he called reflections in poverty, and Professor Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate economist from India. Both of them spoke about the fact that economic development had not led to a human development, and that we had to look at a different way of understanding development. This particular understanding, which was called the human development approach, and which is the current perspective in the world, was first introduced by the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, in 1990 and supported later by other international organizations. Basically, the human development approach stresses upon human well-being as an end for any process of economic or social development. It overturns the view that focuses on material or economic progress as the sole end. This means that now we no longer look at economic indicators, but we begin to look at the well-being of individuals as the ultimate objective. So, it is not important if a country is very rich or very poor, if the well-being of its individuals is not taken care of. The human development approach was embedded as the guiding principle on which the annual human development reports are based. And these HDRs, as they are known today, combine thematic presentations done by experts alongside definitions, measurement and policy analyses of indicators of education, health and income sufficient to ensure adequate living standards. So, combining all of these thematic presentations and combining the different statistics available, the Human Development Index has been created. So, therefore, the Human Development Reports are based on 5 development indices. 1. The Human Development Index HDI. 2. The Human Poverty Index HPI 1 for developing countries and HPI 2 for selected Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development OECD countries. 3. The Gender Related Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. Gender being a critical element, it was embedded in the Human Development Reports. Each of these dimensions are measured on different parameters and finally they are analyzed, leading to the Human Development Report. It is not important for us to understand what are the formula that lead to the way in which this is analyzed. It is enough to say that the Human Development Index is the average of measures of 3 indices: life expectancy, education literacy and the standard of living. And you can go to the Human Development Index, which is produced annually, and look at where your country stands in relation to others in terms of these particular yardsticks of human development. As I said earlier, this is produced by UNDP on an annual basis, but other multinational agencies and in fact other countries produce their own development reports. For example, UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, brings out a State of the World's Children report every year. The International Telecommunications Union brings out the ICT Development Report. World Bank brings out a series of its own reports. UNESCO brings out a Global Monitoring Report on Education. The UN Environment Programs brings out a report on the state of the world's environment, and so on and so forth. Almost each agency and many countries bring out their own individual human development reports. Can you think as to whether your own country brings out its own human development report, and is it possible for you to go to the internet and see what the report says about your own country? I am showing you actually a table that has been captured from a report that came in 2010, which actually analyzed the Human Development Index from 1970 to 2010. I would refer you to go to your text so that you can look at the report more closely, and in doing so, while you look at the table, look at the findings that I am going to draw your attention to. One of the findings that has emerged from the analysis of human development for 40 years, from 1970 to 2010, is that there have been many improvements in all levels of human development. All countries have improved. The life expectancy has gone up, literacy levels have gone up, and income has also gone up. But the gap between developed and developing countries remains high. The rich countries are getting richer, the poor still remain poor. There are in countries differences between urban and rural locations. There are differences between the rich and the poor. So, we have what we call intra-country disparities, and then there are cross-country differences. There is a pattern of increased consumption of goods, material goods, and there is a pattern of environmentally non-sustainable growth. Progress is varied in the Asia Pacific region and worldwide. For example, in many Central Asian republics, there has been a period of regress, especially in health, and this is prompted as a result of the environmental degradation caused, for instance, by excessive mining, which has led to a change in the pollution levels in the societies. In countries such as Southern Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, the AIDS pandemic has actually led to some regress, and that means not progress, but going a little backward in terms of human development. But overall, there has been improvement, but yet it is not enough. So, to summarize, the human development approach has changed the way the world currently looks at development, and that this view is reflected both in international debates and underscores the commitment given by the global community to actively pursue development. And one major commitment which came in the year 2000 is reflected in the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, which are listed in the textbook, are the most broadly supported and specific poverty reduction strategies that the world has committed itself to. They are a common denominator to which all countries, irrespective of their ideology, politics, culture, have adhered. Very often, policy is written as a compromise between conflicting principles, and so therefore, this is the level of agreement that every country has agreed to. This means there could be much more done in individual countries, but all countries have agreed to these goals. Each and every stakeholder in the global community, whether it is the multilateral agencies, whether it is the multilateral agencies, whether it is NGOs, whether it is government, have accepted common goals and targets and strategies for achieving them. But it isn't enough to look at development merely from the perspective of human development. If we talk about human development and we talk about how it is to be promoted, then we also have to look at managing development. When we look at managing development, and if we say that it is the well-being of individuals that is at the core of human development, and allowing that every individual has a right to enjoy the benefits of development, then we have to look at some other core principles. These are the principle of inclusiveness. That means a pattern of growth that allows all people to contribute to and benefit from the development process. Number 2, equality, that all citizens are equal and there are inherent inequalities in citizens. Although theoretically all citizens are equal, in many societies there are differences. Therefore, a policy which enables a systematic approach and what we might call proactive discrimination to ensure that vulnerable groups get a better opportunity to access and benefit from fruits of development is necessary. So, we have inclusiveness and we have equality. It is also another aspect in which we are not just simply saying let us deliver services, but let us look at the quality. The quality is not just the provisioning of services, but ensuring that these services are of good quality. For example, it is not enough just to build a primary health center in a village. It is important that it be staffed with doctors, nurses, medicines, treatment rooms, laboratories, and that these facilities are then made available to the population of that particular location. So, it isn't just about putting in a primary health center, it is also about making sure that the primary health center delivers what it is supposed to deliver. And finally, a principle of accountability, that citizens are partners in a development process and therefore governments need to engage with them, and that citizens should participate in their own process and governments should be held accountable to all citizens. So, management of development in a developing country is complex. It includes a lot of processes and includes a lot of aspects. We have talked about many of the principles, but when a government tries to manage development, it has to use political power and it has to use ethics in promoting development. It is the use of power and good governance to bring about desired goals in contexts that are characterized by conflict of interests, values, agendas, and in shrinking resources. The process of managing development very often looks at policy making and setting development goals, identifying priorities, establishing legislations and regulatory practices, working with different organizations in government and out of it, engaging with citizens both to provide access to and to provision of services and social accountability, monitor and evaluate to show that there has been progress, and to ensure that quality, inclusiveness, equality and accountability are maintained. To summarize this particular section or half of chapter 1, I think it is important to remember that the human development approach is a new paradigm on which, through which countries now look at a process of development. It is more people-centered and it is more humane. It is best exemplified in the Human Development Index and the Human Development Reports. Currently, global development goals are based on this approach, and the Millennium Development Goals, even after 2015, which is the target date, should be seen as milestones on a road to progress rather than endposts in themselves. At this stage, I would like to draw your attention to the assignment that is given in your textbook. You should make the effort to read the article on gross national happiness to see how Bhutan, a country, has looked at development from a completely different perspective. As I recommended at the beginning, please do this practical exercise. You will learn a lot about how development is looked at, and you will understand how much values, benefits, humanity and economic development can actually go hand in hand. We come to the end actually of the first half of the first chapter. We are now going to turn our attention to basic principles in the use of communication and for development. Why communication? That is what we will explain to you now. Communication is a process as old as human society itself and is a process in which all of us are engaged. Think about it. We're always talking. We're talking to each other. We're interacting on the internet. We're talking on the phone. We are leaving visual symbols all the time. Someone on the road says something, we hear it, a horn honks and we respond. So we're constantly either receiving or sending messages. These could be non-verbal without sound, a wink of an eye, or they could be through sound signals like talking. But essentially, communication can be described as a process whereby someone sends a message to someone else through a channel and gets a response of feedback. I'd like to go to the blackboard right now to explain to you a simple model of communication so that you can understand how this entire process takes place. It is necessary to understand this particular model, although it is a very basic model, because we will be then able to separate the process of communication from the tools of communication. Let me explain to you the way in which communication takes place, whether it is between individuals or between large groups. In the first instance, we have a source, that is the origin of the message. It could be you or me, it could be a government, it could be even through the mass media. We have the origin of the source. The origin of the source or the sender creates a message. The message could be about health, it could be about education, it could be asking you to buy a particular product, but this message is created and then is used to be transmitted through a channel. This channel may be through television, it can be through newspapers, it can be in a face-to-face classroom as if we were talking to a group of students, but there has to be a channel of communication. After the channel, we come to the receiver. After all, who is this whole process intended toward? It is intended toward the receiver. The receiver could be an individual, it could be a group, it could be a community. This receiver in turn does not accept a message just simply because it has come. This receiver then sends back feedback or sends back a response which then goes back to the source or the sender of the message. The point I am trying to drive at here is that this whole process of communication takes place within what we know as a common frame of reference. A common frame of reference could be a culture, it could be a language, it could be a political system, but if the sender and the receiver do not live within a common frame of reference, this will not be understood. For example, if I am speaking in English and the student speaks only Spanish, then the student would not understand what I am also trying to say. So this common frame of reference and this process of communication is absolutely critical to irrespective of what we want to say, that is the message, of the way in which we are saying it, that is the channel, and ultimately to the receiver. Very simply put, who says what, through what channel, to whom, with what effect. And that is the classic view of communication, and that is how, although the channels have changed, although we have gone to an internet age, a social media age, the process of communication which takes place within a common frame of reference has not changed. Once we understand the process of communication, we also have to look at the many ways in which communication can take place. Communication can be interpersonal and it can be impersonal. So let us look at communication as interpersonal first. Face-to-face communication, one-to-one, that is, one to a small group, small groups of people communicating with each other, forms basically the basis for interpersonal communication, which is tightly, closely knit, often instant, and therefore feedback in this is immediate and interactivity is very, very high. This means a village meeting. It could also mean a group of people sitting in a coffee shop. It could mean you or I talking to each other. Response is quick, reactions immediate, feedback is quick, and we share a common frame of reference. Communication can also be impersonal through the use of mass media, and I know that every day we listen to radio, watch television, read a newspaper, read books, magazines, films. We also look at visuals such as billboards, pamphlets, and we also go to websites. All of these are impersonal forms of mass communication where there is an intermediary agency between the source and the receiver, that is between you and me. A website of a popular news agency is actually an impersonal medium because we cannot give immediate feedback. In these impersonal media or in these impersonal forms of communication, the ability to communicate overwhelmingly rests with the sender of the message rather than with the receiver, because there is no immediate feedback. It is either one-way flow of communication, and feedback is very weak and non-existent. So even if we were to use a website to solicit responses from a large group of 1 million people, we may get only a few thousand responses. that still says that the response is weak and it is not necessarily immediate as it would be in face-to-face communication. And it is important to understand this distinction when we begin to look at communication and development. So when we try to link the concepts of communication to the concepts of development, we have to recognize two key aspects. One, that the process of communication has to be delinked from the technologies or the channels of communication. And communication is an ongoing process, irreversible in time, and while technologies are the tools or media employed by the process. We have to distinguish between the two because very often the two are confused. The process of communication will take place with or without mass media, with or without internet, with or without social media. But it is each of these are tools that will help either improve the quality of communication, improve the uniformity of the message, or reach more people because they are essentially channels. Having said that, there is evidence from nearly 60 years of research into communication, which basically says that one cannot assume that everybody receives the message in the same way. There is evidence that there are differential effects of the same content or the same media upon different people depending on factors such as age, sex, predispositions or existing attitude, perceptions, the social environment, and past experience. Essentially, the common frame of reference that I was talking about. There is no direct relationship between media, media content, and users. It is important to remember this because we just cannot send a bullet or drop confetti and expect it to have a response. Communication tools such as the impersonal mass media are only one of several factors or variables that influence attitudes and change social behavior. And in development, we are talking about changing social behavior and influencing attitudes. Other factors that come into play are interpersonal relations, access to media, exposure to content, the way channels are organized, social and psychological predispositions. These are all intervening or they come in between the sender and the receiver in the process of communication. The use of interpersonal communication is a must if we want to bring about behavior and social change. That means we cannot use only one channel, only one IT mediated channel. One must use different ways and overlapping messages and overlapping channels in order to reach the many whom we are trying to reach. We also know that just because we send a message, users of communication tools are not passive. They don't accept everything that they are exposed to. They are active participants in the communication process and they use communication tools and content dependent upon their preference, familiarity, and existence of equally more attractive and easy alternatives. For example, social media and social networks that are currently the flavor of the season today, that are currently greatly in use in ways of communicating, are because they allow interactivity and active participation by viewers in the process of communication. Finally, the purpose for which anyone will use a particular tool, use a particular media, whether it's television or whether it's an internet website, will depend on a variety of factors and the extent to which these tools meet an existing need for information, education, for social need, a psychological or economic need. So there is a functional aspect, and if there is no value attached to the content of communication, a user will not use it. Over the past 60 years, communication has emerged as an independent discipline, drawing from various social sciences, and therefore we find among practicing communicators people from psychology, political science, sociology, economics, development studies on the one hand, and from technologies, from the hardwares, the craft, the skills, the knowledge on how to use these tools. a variety of subjects, a variety of themes, and a variety of trades and crafts are part of the process of communication. As a field, we now look at other sub-disciplines such as advertising, social research, media production, delivery, public relations and advocacy, and development communication, which is the major focus of study in this overview. So from now on, we will be talking mostly about development communication and the way it takes place. There is a general relationship between communication and development. That is, the incorporation of communication into development planning and the use of mass media to spread education and development messages. And this has been going on for a very long time, since the 1950s, and results from the field in many countries have led to a better understanding of how communication interplays with the development process. But we are more focused upon what I might call development support communication, and this refers to the organized and systematic use of communication to support a development process, either at a national or a location and project specific level. It is the integration of communication, and in today's parlance, the use of ICTs as part of the planning, design, development, delivery and evaluation of development projects. This is the core of what this primer issue number 1 is all about. There is a history of use of media in global development. We have been using different kinds of tools, the existing technologies of the day from the middle of the 20th century. And in keeping with technological change, whenever a new technology has come, whether it was first radio to television and then television to the more interactive internet, countries and societies have kept pace and tried to use the technology of the day for achieving development targets. Two factors have spurred interest in the last 2 decades. One, technology convergence and the internet, and two, the global development goals as expressed by the Millennium Development Goals, in which specifically target 18 or goal 8 of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and I quote, "In cooperation with the private sector, make available the benefits of new technologies, especially information and communication technologies, for the benefit of development." Therefore, ICTs have become tools that governments can and do deploy in meeting development objectives. And governments that use ICTs as part of an overall governance and administration role find that these technologies help link the different complex planning processes, allow coordination across sectors, enable increased information sharing, allow monitoring and outreach of services, increase access to education, link communities to markets, create disaster warning and decision support systems, and provide a direct link by which government can know about people's views and thereby ensuring a greater accountability and good governance. As change has been taking place, as technologies have been improving, the current trends in ICTD focus from just access to knowledge to a sharing and the participation and the creation of the use of knowledge for development. Earlier, we used to have in the last 10 years reports that used to be called the e-readiness reports, which were brought out both by the UN Secretariat itself and also by the International Telecommunications Union. Today, these reports on e-readiness have shifted to what are known as digital economy rankings, and not just look at how ITs boost industry, but look at how ITs are used to improve the quality of delivering services for this economic and social benefit of a society. So they begin, the digital economy rankings begin now to look at how ICTs have transformed a given society, and it is possible to go to the table that is given in your textbook to look at how your country is ranked on the digital economy rankings. When you look at that particular table, you will notice that those countries in the Asia Pacific region that have invested heavily in next generation internet infrastructure have become leaders in the knowledge economy. For example, when you look at that table, you will find as leaders Korea, China, India, Singapore, among the leaders, among countries that have changed their entire economy based upon their investment in IT. Specifically, the effect of investment in ICT has had an impact not on the huge companies that exist, but on small and medium operations by reducing costs associated with communications and human resources, improved internal communications, maintaining better inventories in a supply chain management, so you don't have so many storage houses and warehouses. You can move products quickly and just in time to deliver. It has improved accounting processes and financial processes. It has improved external communication with clients and allowed small companies which earlier could not do so to explore and reach a global market, thereby increasing volumes of demand, increasing volumes of trade, and improving profits while reducing expenditures. The same benefits can also accrue or can also serve the government or the public sector. As we begin to look at knowledge economies, we have to know that there is sufficient evidence today to show that the relationship between ICTs and economic growth exists. And as I said earlier, countries that have had high levels of economic development also have had high ICT penetration rates. Results show, as indicated in your textbook in the diagrams, that for every 10 percentage points increase in the penetration of broadband services, there is an increase in economic growth of 1.3 percentage points. Take a look at this bar graph. This bar graph, which comes from the World Bank document, which basically shows the relationship between investment in broadband services and the investment and the growth in terms of the economy. Again, when I talked about countries investing in broadband and in latest internet infrastructure, look at where the global distribution of offshore IT and ITS services are. You will notice that two countries form nearly 2/3 of the global market in offshore IT and ITES services. These are countries, and in the case of the Asia Pacific, countries like India that have invested not so much in just manufacturing, but much more in the provision of services. There are other countries and there are parallels to be drawn, but what is important is that among developing countries, the investment made by India has yielded results over the last 10 years. But if the knowledge economy in countries that have invested in information infrastructure is based upon the development and trade of knowledge products such as and services such as consultancies, software design, and also simple things like call centers, is to a large extent dependent on innovations made by others. So a knowledge economy is often based upon improving and using innovations in ICTs that were made by others. On the other hand, a knowledge society, which is where current trends show that we are headed, is about a society's capabilities to identify, produce, process, transform, disseminate, and use information to build and apply knowledge, which is the product of IT, for human development. And the link between knowledge and development is fundamental to the building of knowledge societies, where knowledge is necessary both to achieve economic goals and also to enable human development. Where this does not take place, and globally, when we begin to look at the knowledge economy and we begin to look at ITs, we begin to look at media, one of the startling differences that comes is what is known as the digital divide. The digital divide is essentially a gap between individuals and societies that have the resources and those who do not. It's really a reflection of several divides: income, gender, literacy. That is, between those who have and those who have not, and the gap that exists between the two is the digital divide. And the digital divide impacts on the persistence of social inequality. And to address the digital divide, one does not have to look only at ITs, but has to look at a broader perspective at issues that are involved. For instance, it isn't enough just to build a fiber optic cable system. One needs to have a clear and enabling policy. One needs to address fundamental constraints to economic development. One needs to improve infrastructure, open markets, break monopolies, have a regulatory system, and of course, increase access to education for all. Specifically, when we look at the ways in which ICTs can be used to bridge the digital divide, one, create the infrastructure links that then provide the broadband or latest internet infrastructure all over the country. Promote universal access by policies and actions at a national level on the one hand, and in smaller areas, in sectoral areas, begin modestly with data processing, teleworking, invest in education, formal and non-formal. Create portals where information is stored and where specific development knowledge is available and updated. To access the information, create common service centers and services which extend reach and access to local communities. Create opportunities for using newer technologies such as mobile phones, and create overlapping services. All this seems simple when it is listed, but it is not. It actually involves a transformation of the way in which governments today function in addressing development goals, and that is why it is important. We find, as we look throughout the world, that in bridging the international digital divide and in applying the benefits of ICTs to development, there is an extensive role played by organizations such as UNESCO, UNDP, UNICEF, the Food and Agriculture Organization FOU, the ITU, the World Health Organization WHO, the Asian Development Bank, the International Development Research Center, the Department for International Development of the UK, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and many others that exist as international and multilateral organizations and also as international NGOs. The UN basically set up in the year 2000, soon after the declaration of the Millennium Development Goals, the Global Alliance for ICT in Development as an effort to bring together both the private sector and the public sector to promote the use of ICTs. Parallelly, with the nodal agency as the ITU, the World Summit on Information Society was held in 2 rounds, the first round in Geneva in 2003 and the second round in Tunis in 2005. In both WSIS 1 and 2, there was a program of action, and there's a plan of action and a program agenda which spoke of the different ways in which ICTs can be used for development. And the next section, in section 2, we will be talking about some of the applications. But suffice it to say here that most countries have accepted the WSIS agenda and the plan of action. Within our region and within our immediate mandate, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific and its sub-regional body, the Asia Pacific Center for ICT Human Capacity Building, identifies as the high target countries of the Asia Pacific, the least developed countries, the Pacific Island countries, and the landlocked isolated countries. of the region for special attention. These high target countries are mentioned by the Millennium Development Goals as a special focus for attention by all international bodies, and they do form the focus of attention here also. So, basically, to summarize, the points that we must remember are that ICTs can be used to meet development goals, and this has been embedded in the MDGs in Goal 8. They can be used to provide improved and equitable delivery of services, to facilitate complex planning and coordination, and to enable increased sharing. The active engagement and the use of ICTs for development is called ICTD. This began with the UN-APCICT task force, which became the Global Alliance for ICTs in Development. To work out and spell out a plan of action, two major conferences, WSIS 1 and 2, were held in 2003 and 2005. Following 2005, most international agencies have engaged with ICTs for D in their mandated area of operations. I would now like you to go to second exercise. Try to do this exercise to see how ICTs have been used to address different development objectives here. Go to this website. It's a fascinating story of how a small village in Nepal used computers which they assembled inside wooden boxes and then built up an entire region isolated from the rest of the country by nearly 8 hours of travel to bring it up to levels of exploitation of ICTs to address specific goals of health, nutrition, education in their particular community. How have the ICTs been addressed here? What has been used? Organize the lists and add to that in terms of the earlier question in this presentation. Link the development goals to ICTs and development. This brings us to the end of chapter 1. This brings us to the end of chapter 1, and after this we will be looking at the technologies themselves.